My name is Maria Reed, and this is my oral presentation for my CRJ 221 class, which is my interview, investigation, and writing report class. And we have to finish our report on an armed robbery case that we were given, and we had to investigate suspects and witnesses, and interview witnesses and suspects and do interrogations on the suspects. And I'm going to start out with my report. It's an armed robbery. It's case number 151452228. At approximately 02:55 hours, Officer Reed, a badge number 465, received a radio call from dispatcher to the Starlight Diner located at 2465 Proper Avenue, in the city of Novi, in reference to shots fired at a local 24-hour diner. One person was shot in the arm. Upon my arrival at approximately 03:01 hours, I was the first officer on scene. I was met by a male who gave his name as Chris Sharp and a female who identified herself as Karen Boris. Both appeared to be in emotional distress. Both stated they were employees at the restaurant and that they had just been robbed at gunpoint by a man who took off 10 minutes prior to my arrival. And there was a male customer inside with a gunshot wound to the arm. The wife was also inside with the restaurant with him. As I entered the restaurant, I observed a white male who appeared to be bleeding from the left arm. The victim was laying on the floor next to the table. Male victim was soon identified as Tim Brokaw. I then observed a visibly upset white female sitting next to the victim, holding pressure to his left arm. Who was also soon identified as Katie Brokaw, the wife of Mr. Brokaw, which was the victim. I radioed dispatch at approximately 03:11 hours to get the ETA for arrival of EMS from Mr. Brokaw, and EMS approximately arrived around 03:16 hours. At approximately 03:29 hours, Mr. Brokaw was transported to Grace Regional Medical Center for treatment of his gunshot wounds, and Mrs. Brokaw rode in the ambulance with him. I then interviewed Mr. Sharp and Miss Boris, who were the employees and who were present at the time. I asked them to explain to me what they recall of the incident. Mr. Sharp stated, on April 3rd, 2015, approximately 02:10 hours, Mr. Sharp and Miss Boris were standing behind the counter having a conversation. A white male who appeared to be in his 30s, wearing blue jeans, black hoodie, with what appeared to be black hair, walked into the restaurant brandishing what appeared to be a black handgun. The male pointed at Mr. Sharp. I pointed at Mr. Sharp and Miss Boris, demanding money from the cash register. Mr. Sharp stated as he proceeded to open the cash register, the gunman reached over the counter, started grabbing money, placed it in his pockets. Miss Boris stated at this time is when customer Mr. Brokaw stood up, told the gunman to grab what he needed and to leave. Miss Boris stated the gunman turned to his right, pointing the gun at Mr. Brokaw. The male fired several rounds, hitting Mr. Brokaw twice in the arm. Mr. Sharp stated that the gunman was in the restaurant for about 20 minutes or so, and then after the shots were fired, he jumped into a passenger side of a late model Buick GMC, approximately 1995 and 99, approximately a white in color. And I also asked both Mr. Sharp and Miss Boris if they seen the male suspect again and the vehicle, would they be able to identify it, and they both stated yes. And I had nothing further at that time. I then interviewed Mrs. Brokaw, which was the victim's wife, and she pretty much stated the same exact thing. The only extra information that she gave was that the gunman had dropped a black bandana that had fallen out of his back left pocket of his blue jeans when he was leaving. She also stated the exact type of vehicle that the previous witnesses had stated. Upon further investigation, we were able to get a person of interest name, and that was a Mr. Morgan. His name was Dexter Morgan. I brought him in for an interview on April 8th at approximately 0900 hours, and Mr. Morgan first denied any involvement whatsoever. Then I had kind of threatened him and told him, well, what happened, if I had video that proved that he was there and that he did the shooting and everything. And he finally did admit that he was there. At that time, I did advise him of his rights and read him his Miranda rights. And Mr. Morgan agreed to speak with me without his attorney present, and explained to me that my one of my main witnesses, Mr. Sharp, who was also a employee there, was the one who set up everything. He stated that Mr. Sharp owed him money for some weed that he had sold him, and Mr. Sharp set it all up so that he could get his money back. So he set the robbery up. And Mr. Morgan said he didn't mean for anybody to get shot or hurt. He just freaked out when Mr. Brokaw stood up. And then about April 9th, the next day, we were able to bring in Mr. Sharp in. And Mr. Sharp, he seemed kind of really fidgety, was kind of profusely sweating. He kind of indicated that he was really nervous to be there. On the other hand, Mr. Morgan was very calm, cool, collected, didn't show any signs of distress, or didn't indicate to me at first that he could have any involvement in it, because he didn't have any, didn't seem nervous in any way whatsoever, as Mr. Sharp did when I brought him in the second time for interrogation. And at first he denied his involvement, and then I told him that Mr. Morgan had a signed confessed statement, and that he was the one who set up the whole entire thing. Well, then Mr. Sharp then confessed that he did take part in setting up the robbery for that reason. And so therefore I also advised him that he was placed him under arrest for conspiracy to commit robbery and conspiracy to commit attempted murder in the robbery and shooting of the Starlight Diner. And then I advised him of his Miranda rights. And Mr. Sharp continued in a way to kind of deny his involvement, and then he admitted again that he had something to do with it, and then he refused to answer any more of my questions, so I had to discontinue the interrogation at that time and had an officer come in and place him in handcuffs and start the processing. So suspect number 1 and number 2 are in custody. Suspect number 3, who would be the driver, is still at large. And everything was turned over to the DA, and then we are now in court. The methods I've used with both of them is more of a traditional thing. I just built a rapport with both of them, and asked them, you know, if it's okay if I call them by their first name or their last name, and both prefer to be called by their first name. It kind of made it more of a personal thing, and if you can build that rapport, you have to be able to do that. I also went off of body language. Body language can tell you a lot. If they're fidgety, if they're sweating profusely, if they're looking down and not really talking to you, or looking at you when they're talking, it kind of indicates that they're hiding something. And I didn't get that with Mr. Morgan. He seemed very cool, calm, and collected, like he had nothing to do with anything. And I could tell because of his street-wise. He's a big drug lord in his area, so he's more of... he wants to keep his name as this big drug guy and doesn't want anybody to, he doesn't basically want his name to be discredited. So, with all the information that was gathered, and my report was 22 pages long, and that includes the initial report, the witness interviews, the victim's wife's interview, the suspect's interview, and the suspect number 2 interview, and their interview transcripts into interrogations. It came out to 22 pages, which was a lot. The legal thing I just made sure that I avoided was to make sure that I read them the Miranda rights when warranted and when needed, and I didn't question them. And when they refused to do any type of questioning without their attorney present, that I immediately seized the interrogation or the interview, whichever one came first, and discontinued it and let their attorney deal with it. The ethical part, my only theory with that, and I don't want to say theory, but what I think with being ethical or unethical is that you have to remain professional at all times. And as long as you remain professional at all times, there's no way you're going to become unethical in any type of interview or any type of communications. When you're communicating with a suspect or a witness, there's no way you can violate any of their rights as long as you act professional. And if you act professional, then you act ethical, and there's no legal issues. So that's my report.